People of the Northeast. The northeastern part of North America is covered with forests, lakes, and streams. For the Indians living here, the trees, plants, and wildlife were the source of their food, clothing, transportation, tools, weapons, and even their homes. Many of the tribes in these northern woodlands were Algonquian. They were mainly hunters, and they moved several times a year to follow the animals. Because they moved so often, the homes they built could not be permanent. The Algonquins lived in wigwams. Young trees formed the frameworks. They were covered with animal skins and birch bark. Some of the larger pieces of bark might be rolled up and taken to new locations. The women of the tribes did most of the work setting them up. A fire burned in a shallow pit in the center. Above it was a hole to allow the smoke to escape. The Algonquins hunted deer, caribou, and other animals with their bows and stone-tipped arrows. Sometimes they used deadfalls to trap large animals. Small animals were often caught in snares. Back at the village, the women prepared the meat. They boiled it or cooked it over an open fire. Many cooking pots and containers were made from birch bark because it is so easy to fold. The most common type had a square bottom and a round top. These Indians were excellent woodworkers. One of their most important tools was the crooked knife. It was made by attaching a beaver's tooth to a curved handle. They built birch bark canoes to travel the lakes, streams, and rivers. One canoe took several people up to 3 weeks to construct. Fishing was a year-round activity. All sorts of fishing gear were used: nets, spears, harpoons, and hooks. At night, they attracted fish to the surface with light from a birch bark torch. One man paddled the canoe, and the other speared the fish. Along the coast, the Indians gathered clams, oysters, mussels, and other sea life that came close to shore. In the Great Lakes region, canoes were used to gather wild rice. It was a main source of food for the tribes living here. In many parts of the Northeast, mapling was important. The women and children gathered the sap from the maple trees in birch bark troughs and boiled it down to make syrup and sugar. In winter, the children would enjoy snow cones made by filling birch bark cones with snow and maple syrup. Of course, they couldn't eat the cones. Just as the Indians depended upon nature for food, shelter, and transportation, they also depended upon it for clothing. Most of their garments were made from animal skins. It was the women who stretched and tanned or softened the hides. The men wore breechclouts and leggings. Their leggings were tight-fitting and had a short fringe so that it wouldn't get caught in the brush. A breechclout was a strip that hung over a belt in front and in back. They often wore a headdress called an artificial roach. Women wore skirts, leggings, and, when it was cold, a cape. Men and women both wore moccasins. Here in the Northeast, the moccasins were soft-soled. The styles varied from one tribe to another. In the winter, they wore fur robes, which also served as bed coverings. Sometimes they wore moose-hide boots or stuffed their moccasins with deer hair. Skins of small animals were sometimes wrapped around their heads. The Indians embroidered much of their clothing and other belongings. The women did beautiful work with dyed porcupine quills. Later on, when glass beads were brought to America, the women became skilled at beadwork too. The Algonquins depended upon nature for everything. They believed that a spirit lived in every natural thing. The force behind all of the spirits, both good and evil, was called Manitou. Their priests were called shamans. The shamans of the Chippewa tribes belonged to a grand medicine society called the Midewiwin. They used medicinal plants to cure diseases, and they were believed to communicate with the Manitous. Not all of the Indians of the Northeast Woodlands were Algonquian. The Iroquois also settled here. Life for the Iroquois centered around farming. Therefore, their villages were more permanent. These tribes lived in large bark longhouses. Families of the same clan lived together. When a man married, he became a member of his wife's clan, and he moved into her family's longhouse. Each family in the longhouse had its own bunk and storage cell. A row of cooking fires ran down the center aisle. Each fire was shared by two families. Holes in the roof allowed the smoke to escape. Life for the Iroquois was very much regulated by the seasons. In the spring, the men cleared the land and the women planted the seeds. Corn, beans, and squash, often called the Three Sisters, were the main crops. They were tended during the summer and harvested in the fall. A good harvest was important so that enough could be stored for the long winter months. Corn was the most important of all. The women shelled the corn and ground it in large wooden mortars. The Iroquois held many festivals in honor of the crops and the seasons. Some were related to corn: the planting festival, the green corn festival, and the harvest festival, which was the origin of today's Thanksgiving celebration. Some of the Iroquois shamans belonged to a false face society. They carved false face masks used in some of the ceremonies. First, the mask was carved on a living basswood tree by the person who saw the face in a dream. Then it was removed and painted. If it was cut out in the morning, it was painted red. If it was cut out in the afternoon, it was painted black. The masks were intended to ward off evil spirits. Husk face messengers ran through the villages wearing corn husk masks. They represented the agricultural spirits who taught them to grow their crops. Although the Iroquois were farmers, the men added to their food supply by hunting too. They were among the few North American tribes to use a blowgun. Of course, they hunted with bows and arrows as well. Hunting was also important for the bone and horn they needed to make their combs, tools, and other utensils, and the skins needed to make their clothing. Their clothing was similar to the Algonquian, except that their leggings were looser and had embroidered seams instead of fringe. Their moccasins, too, were similar. They were often beautifully decorated. Also, like their Algonquian neighbors, the Iroquois believed in spirits and gods of nature. They called the great power behind the spirits Orenda. Since contact with Orenda was thought to come in dreams, all dreams had to be obeyed. They also believed in two brothers, the good master of life and the evil master of life. It was the good master who gave them good weather and who was responsible for everything good. The evil master was responsible for everything bad. He could even prolong winter if it was his desire. The Iroquois were great warriors. For a long time, the different tribes battled one another. Then, around the year 1570, 5 of the tribes were united into the League of the Great Peace. The 5 tribes were the Senecas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, the Oneidas, and the Mohawks. The League's symbol was a pine tree. For many years, they did not fight each other. The Iroquois made beads from hard clam or quahog shells. The shells were mostly white with some purple. Since there was less purple, the purple shells became more valuable. These beads were put on strings and used almost like money. Some were woven into belts. The designs on them recorded messages and events such as treaties. The woodland Indians enjoyed many games. Lacrosse was especially popular with the Iroquois. Snow snake was played by all the tribes in the northern woodlands. A level track was made in the snow. A long maple stick was smoothed out and one end was carved to resemble a snake's head. The object of the game was to see who could throw it the farthest. Guessing games were also popular. The moccasin game was played with 4 moccasins and 4 small objects, such as pebbles or fruit pits. One object would be marked. The opposing team would have to guess which moccasin held the marked object. Algonquian or Iroquois, the Indians of the Northeast lived in harmony with nature. They celebrated the rich resources of their woodland environment. Of the Southeast. The Southeast was made up of many different landscapes. Muskogean, Algonquian, Iroquoian, and Siouan tribes lived in the mountains, plains, swamps, and along the coasts. They were farmers, hunters, fishermen, and gatherers. Summers here were long and hot, and little clothing was needed. Women wore skirts of skin or cloth. In winter, they sometimes added a tunic of woven mulberry bark. Throughout much of the region, the men wore little or no clothing. Sometimes they wore a fringe of mulberry bark or a breechclout. Leggings were occasionally added in the underbrush to protect their legs. For ceremonial occasions, they often wore a robe covered with bird feathers. Special headdresses were also worn. Important men wore engraved shell discs, called gorgets, around their necks as signs of authority. Many of the men were warriors. They often shaved their heads, leaving scalp locks as a challenge to try to take their scalps. Tattooing was popular in many tribes. When a boy was first named, he was scratched. He was again scratched every time he proved himself as a warrior. The most important language family in the Southeast was Muskogean. The largest group of Muskogeans was the Creek Confederacy. It was made up of about 50 tribes. Their towns were often stockaded. Fields of corn, squash, beans, and fruit surrounded the town. They were owned by the town and divided into family sections. Some of the homes also had private gardens. The men cleared the land, and the women did most of the planting and harvesting. Generosity was encouraged by all the southeastern tribes. The Creeks showed their generosity by storing a portion of their harvest in a public granary. It was used to feed visitors, members of their chiefdom who needed help, war parties, and men leaving on public missions. Like many southeastern tribes, the Creeks were hunters as well as farmers. Each town claimed its surrounding territory as hunting grounds. Sometimes the men wore deerskins as they stalked the animals with their bows and cane arrows. Cane was useful because it grows perfectly straight. Cane blowguns were used to hunt small animals. Knives were made by cutting a short length of cane on a slant. The creek men also did some fishing. Hooks and lines, traps, nets, and spears were all used. Sometimes they even drugged the fish with roots and herbs and then collected them. Creek towns were very well organized. A central square served as a public meeting place. Chiefs' houses were built higher up on mounds. The people's houses were outside the square. Most had at least a summer house and a winter house. The wealthy had 4 separate buildings: a small, warm winter house, which was also used as a kitchen, an open summer house, and 2 storage houses. In one corner of the town was the hothouse, the men's winter recreation center. In another section was an open field where the game of chunky was played. A smooth disc of stone was rolled along the ground. The players threw long sticks where they thought the disc would stop. Whoever came closest won. Stickball was extremely popular with the Creeks and other southeastern tribes. In fact, these games were so important that arguments over territory were often settled by the outcome of a ball game. Creek families, or clans, were split into 2 divisions, the white and the red. White clans were associated with peace. They were the healers and religious leaders of the tribe. It was their leaders who chose the chief, or Miko. The Red Creeks were the warriors. War clubs and bows and arrows were the most important weapons for all of the southeastern tribes. The Seminoles were at one time part of the Creek Confederacy. They moved deep into the swamplands of Florida. There they traveled the waterways in dugout canoes. It was hot most of the year. Their homes, called chickees, had open sides and thatched roofs. They were built on stilts as protection against the wet ground and the snakes. The Seminoles came in contact with the Europeans early and soon copied their colorful style of clothing. West of the Creeks was another Muskogean tribe, the Chickasaw. Chickasaws were skilled and brave warriors. South of the Chickasaws lived another important Muskogean tribe, the Choctaw. Farming was especially important to them. Nearby were the Natchez. They too spoke the Muskogean language. The Natchez descended from the ancient temple builders and built their temples on great mounds. They were divided into 4 classes: sons, nobles, honored, and stinkards. Their ruler, the Great Sun, was believed to be descended from the sun itself. He was so sacred that he had to be carried around on a litter so that his feet would not touch ground. The Cherokee Nation, one of the largest in the East, was not Muskogean, but Iroquoian. Like most southeastern tribes, the Cherokee were farmers, hunters, fishermen, and gatherers. The Cherokees were a mountain people. The White Party was associated with peace, and the Red Party with war. In the center of each town was the town square. High on a mound was the 7-sided council house. Inside the council house, the town chief met with his councilors. The people lived in houses scattered around the square. Many had more than one house, as did the Creeks and other southeastern tribes. In winter, it was cold where the Cherokee lived. At night, the family often gathered around the fire in the center of the house. Each family was given a field to work according to its needs. A big family got a big field. A small family got a smaller one. All the men worked together to clear the fields. If someone was too old or too sick, his work was done for him. Corn was especially important. They danced to the Old Woman of the Corn, who, according to their belief, made the corn grow. The most important occasion for most of the southeastern tribes was the busk, or green corn ceremony. It came with the ripening of the new crop. Until it was held, no new corn could be eaten. Included in the ceremony were both fasting and feasting. There was also much singing and dancing. The busk of most tribes included the drinking of a very strong beverage called the black drink. The busk symbolized a fresh start and a new beginning. In many tribes, old disagreements were settled, and people were forgiven for their crimes. They got new clothing, new tools, new pottery. The climax of the busk was the priest's kindling of a new fire. It was a tedious job. Everyone took some of the flame back home to start their own new fires. The southeastern Indians had a rich heritage of arts and crafts. They carved pipes, jars, and other objects out of stone and wood. They fashioned beautiful axes by grinding stone and rubbing it into shape. The axes were polished to a high finish. Fine designs were engraved on shell cups, gorgets, and other artifacts. The women wove mats and baskets out of cane and fashioned fine pottery out of clay. The pottery was decorated in a number of ways. It was painted, engraved, and stamped with designs. The Indians of the Southeast believed that man, animals, and plants are all interrelated. Although it was necessary to kill animals for food, to do so without respect would cause the animal to take revenge. For example, Creek hunters believed that improper hunting of a deer could cause rheumatic pains, arthritis, and other diseases. However, they thought of plants as the natural friends of man. If diseases did occur, plants could be used to cure them. The Southeast Indians had a rich cultural heritage. This heritage was based on oral traditions, which were passed down from generation to generation. People of the Plains. Hundreds of years ago, many Indian tribes inhabited the wide open spaces of the Great Plains. The early tribes settled in the eastern plains, where the soil was rich and rainfall was dependable. There they farmed the fertile land, made pottery, and established large stockaded villages. Often the villages were set up high above rivers so they could see who approached. Northern tribes like the Mandan and the Pawnee built large, sturdy earth lodges. They had log frameworks covered with grass, earth, and sod to protect them from the severe winters of the northern plains. Many families shared the same lodge with their animals. A central fire provided heat and light. Above it was a hole so that the smoke could escape. When it rained, they often covered the hole with their boats made of skin. In nice weather, many people gathered on the roofs to enjoy the sun. Early southern tribes like the Wichita and the Caddo built grass huts that resembled beehives. They were similar to the earth lodges of the north, but the mild climate made the sod coverings unnecessary. At that time, huge herds of buffalo roamed the western plains. When the herds came close to the villages, the men left to follow them. Their traveling homes were teepees. They could easily be set up and taken down. Teepees were built by setting up a framework of poles and covering it with buffalo skins which had been sewn together. They stayed cool in summer and warm in winter. The Indians transported their belongings, including their teepees, on a dog travois. It was made by fastening 2 teepee poles to the dog and placing the load across them. The teepees couldn't be too large, or the dogs wouldn't be able to drag the poles. The hunt was filled with danger. A herd of buffalo was a hard match for a group of men on foot. Often some of the men ran the herds over cliffs or into corrals, while others waited for them with their bows and arrows. After the Spaniards brought horses to America, life on the plains changed. Indian and horse seemed destined to meet. Before long, those living on the plains became expert riders. Tribes like the Sioux, the Cheyenne, and the Blackfoot flourished. Now they could hunt the buffalo from horseback. Arrows were marked, so the hunters could prove their marksmanship. Although some tribes, like the Mandan, continued to farm, gradually most gave it up entirely except for their small patches of tobacco. The horse travois made it possible to transport larger teepees. Now whole families could travel together. Many different tribes pushed further and further west, following the great herds of buffalo. Since they spoke different languages, they developed a system of sign language so they could communicate with one another. By gesturing, they could carry on a conversation. When the people were far apart, they often used smoke signals to communicate. In this way, they could warn of danger or alert the others to the presence of buffalo or other game. The buffalo provided for almost every need. After a successful hunt, everyone feasted on roasted buffalo meat. Some of the meat was dried on racks and stored for future use. The dried meat was also pounded and mixed with wild berries and fat. The mixture was called pemmican. It could be stored almost indefinitely. The pemmican and other belongings were carried in a parfleche. A parfleche was a container made of painted buffalo hide. It could easily be carried on horseback and was very practical for these people who moved about so much. The women tanned and stretched the hides. They used the hides to make their clothing. During most of the year, the men wore a breechclout, leggings with long fringe, and moccasins. Unlike the Indians living in other regions of North America, here they made their moccasins with hard rawhide soles which matched the left and right feet. The women wore deerskin dresses with knee-length leggings and moccasins. Many of their dresses were decorated with elk's teeth. Since only a few teeth could be used from each elk, a dress with a lot of teeth meant that the woman's husband was a fine hunter. In the winter, robes and blankets were made of whole buffalo skins with the fur left on for extra warmth. The fur was worn on the inside. Men painted their robes with symbols of their brave deeds. Women often painted theirs with a sunburst design. The Plains Indians had a special means of recording the history of their tribe. They painted a figure representing the most important event of the year on a buffalo hide. Each year, a figure was added in a spiral. These hides are called winter counts because the Indians kept track of time by the number of winters that passed. Hide painting is only one example of the rich heritage of arts and crafts of the Plains Indians. The women decorated many of their belongings with dyed porcupine quills. When the Indians began trading with the Europeans for glass beads, The women became skilled at beadwork as well. Although they got the beads from others, the craft was strictly Indian. Soon it became even more popular than quill work. Sewing was a difficult chore. Holes had to be punched in the skins with a small pointed bone tool called an awl. The buffalo bones, teeth, and horns provided other tools and utensils as well. Tools to stretch and tan the hides, cups, bowls, knives, and spoons. And so the buffalo hunt became the most important activity on the plains. The buffalo gave them almost everything they needed, and so they had time for leisure. And time for war. These great horsemen and hunters became great warriors. Most belonged to a war society. Some wars were fought to defend their tribal and hunting grounds. But most were fought for adventure and glory. It was more important for a warrior to take risks and show his bravery than to kill enemies. Making a coup, or touching the enemy, was the most important of all. Some carried special poles adorned with feathers to do this. They were called coup sticks. Afterwards, the warriors would tell and retell accounts of their brave deeds in battle. Boasting was permissible as long as the details were accurate. The bravest warriors wore bonnets of eagle feathers. Each feather represented a coup. The long flowing headdresses were impressive on the wide open plains. Even the artificial roach, worn by other North American Indians just for decoration, had to be earned on the plains. Warriors had special war shirts. Some were decorated with the warrior's outstanding deeds. Every warrior had a special shield made from the shrunken, thick neck skin of the buffalo. The designs on the shields were believed to have such magical powers that the owner would be protected in battle. The designs usually came to the warrior in a vision or dream. Visions were an important part of religion on the plains. These people believed that the Great Spirit gave a soul to all living things. A young man sat alone for days, fasting and praying for a vision. Often he dreamed of an animal who would from then on be his protector. Visions also told the Indians what objects to put together as a charm for protection. The objects were kept safe in a sacred bundle, sometimes called a medicine bundle. Medicine bundles were passed down from generation to generation. The most important ceremony on the plains was the sun dance. The dancers went without food or water and often suffered great pain in return for help from the spirits. The ceremony took place in a circular shed made with poles with leafy branches. In the center was a tree that had been cut down to represent an enemy captured and killed. Music was important, and drums, rattles, and chanting accompanied most rituals. Pipes, too, were a part of most ceremonies. On the plains, the sacred pipes, called calumets, were made from a stone called catlinite. Catlinite is soft and easy to shape when first dug out, but it later hardens. Plains Indians enjoyed many games. A popular game among the men was the hoop and pole game. Wooden poles were thrown at a wooden ring. The number of points earned depended upon how the poles fell in relation to the hoop. Men and women alike enjoyed all sorts of gambling and guessing games. In the winter, Indian boys enjoyed spinning tops made of bone, horn, or wood on the ice. They kept them going by hitting them with rawhide whips. Boys and men used the rib cage of the buffalo as a sled. Women and girls rode on wooden toboggans. Little girls played house with miniature teepees and dolls. Sometimes they put their dolls in toy baby carriers. At night, everyone gathered around and listened to the storyteller relate tales about great hunters and great warriors, and stories of supernatural animals and birds and other spirits. Stories that would carry on the great culture and traditions of life on the plains. People of the Southwest. Indians have lived in the southwestern part of North America for thousands of years. It is a land of steep canyons and dry deserts, a land of little rainfall. Early Indians carved pictures in the smooth walls of the cliffs and caves. It would not seem that this land would be at all suited for farming, and yet it was here that the gardens of the Pueblos and the other farming tribes flourished. The Pueblos were descendants of the early Indian tribes. Those who lived near rivers developed irrigation works to bring water to their fields. Those who didn't became skilled at dry farming. They planted deep to use the moisture way down. The men and boys planted and harvested their fields of corn, beans, squash, and cotton. They usually wore a white kilt with a decorated sash. The women often wore cotton dresses dyed blue with sunflower seeds. They usually went barefoot and saved their moccasins for special occasions. Married women wore moccasins that looked like white boots. Their hair was worn to resemble the fruit of a squash plant. Unmarried girls wore their hair in two buns to resemble a squash blossom. The Pueblos lived in apartment-like homes also called pueblos. They were built of stone and adobe, a special clay. Much of the building and plastering was done by the women. The houses were several stories high, often in a step design. Many were built high on cliffs. There were no doors or windows in the lower story. The people climbed up ladders and went in through a hole in the roof. This meant a lot of climbing for a Pueblo woman who had to carry the water to her home. When enemies approached, the Pueblos quickly pulled the ladders up. Each clan had a certain section of the Pueblo. The clan gave out rooms to the families according to their needs. In one room was a grinding bin. The women ground the corn on a large flat stone called a metate. The Pueblos knew many ways in which to cook the corn. A special way was into thin pancakes called piqui. The batter had to be spread quickly over a hot stone. Since it was spread with her bare hands, the woman had to be very careful not to get burned. Sometimes the men added to the food supply by hunting. The boys often hunted rabbits with boomerang-shaped throwing sticks. In every pueblo was an underground chamber called a kiva. The kiva served two purposes. It was where religious ceremonies were held, and it was a social club for the men. The Pueblos had many ceremonies. Most of them involved a prayer for rain. They even had prayer sticks which resembled paddles with cymbals and feathers. They could be left wherever a prayer was needed. Most Pueblo tribes believed in kachina spirits who could bring rain. Masked dancers performed rituals which were carefully rehearsed. They believed that if each step and gesture were done correctly, the Kachinas would be present. The masks they wore were made of deer or buffalo hide. They symbolized the Kachinas' powers and the things they prayed for, such as rain, sunshine, and a good harvest. Clowns, called koshare, sometimes lightened up the ceremonies. The children's fathers and uncles carved Kachina dolls for them. These dolls were not toys, but they could be played with to remind the children of the many Kachina spirits. An important ceremony for the Pueblo tribe called the Hopi is the snake ceremony. Snakes were collected from the 4 directions, washed and prayed over. They participated in a dance and were released as messengers to the gods to beg for rain. The Hopi were excellent musicians. They had rattles and other instruments. The songs they wrote were sometimes sold to other tribes. The Indians of the Southwest have a rich heritage of arts and crafts. The Pueblo women became outstanding potters. The shapes of their pottery were practical as well as beautiful. Storage and water jars were carefully painted. The Pueblo men wove the cotton they grew into cloth. Sometimes rabbit fur, feathers, dog hair, and even buffalo wool were added to the cotton. The Pueblos had a council of clan chiefs and priests who ran the town. Each had a different job. For example, the speaker was like a town crier. He announced all important news and ceremonies. Actually, little government was needed because the Pueblos were a very peaceful people. Sometimes they had to fight in self-defense. The wandering hunting tribes of the region often raided the villages of the peaceful Pueblos. The Navajos were among the tribes that roamed the Southwest hunting and gathering. They learned a lot from the Pueblos, but they always adapted what they learned to suit their needs. They became farmers, and after sheep were brought to America, they became herders too. The Navajos also learned to weave from the Pueblos. However, here the women did the weaving. Designs were passed down from mother to daughter. The blankets they wove were fine examples of their craftsmanship. They abandoned their buckskin dress and adopted the Pueblo style of clothing. They changed it by making their dresses in 2 pieces instead of 1, and by often adding some stripes. The homes they lived in, called hogans, were at first a type of earth lodge with a framework of heavy poles. Later on, they became 6- or 8-sided buildings. They learned about silver from the Spaniards and became skilled silversmiths. They made beautiful jewelry by combining the silver with turquoise and other stones. The Navajos believed that everything in nature must be in harmony. Illness was the surest sign of disharmony. They held elaborate healing ceremonies in which a sand painter dropped dry pigments, charcoal, and powdered stone onto a bed of clean sand. The sick person sat in the middle of the painting. Pinches of it were placed on the patient's body. The gods symbolized in the painting were believed to enter the sick body and cure it. The painting had to be destroyed by sunset of the day it was begun. The Apaches also lived in the Southwest. They traveled together in small bands. Some Apache tribes looked and dressed much like the Indians of the plains. They were hunters, but a few did some farming. Their most important weapons were their bows and arrows. They carried them in quivers and bow cases. The Apaches became skilled horsemen and fierce warriors. The training of young warriors was harsh and intense. Sometimes they were made to run several miles in the heat with a mouthful of water, they could not swallow the water. Other times, a young warrior practiced dodging arrows as they were fired at him. Many Apaches lived in dwellings called wickiups. They were made of branches and grass laid over a framework of poles. In times of peace, the wickiups were sturdy and well made. In times of war, they were crude shelters quickly thrown together. They could break camp in a matter of minutes. One of the most important rituals practiced by the Apaches is the mountain spirit ceremony. The performers impersonated the mountain spirits believed to be living in the sacred mountains. Part of this ceremony to ward off evil is the Apache fire dance. The Apaches supplemented their food supply by gathering seeds and wild plants. Because the Apaches traveled so much, their favored containers were baskets. They wove them out of grasses, roots, and stems. The Indians of the Southwest had different homes, different crafts, different lifestyles. They all tried to live in harmony with nature and to use the land and its resources in the best way they knew how. Of the Northwest. Along the Northwest coast, only a narrow strip of land runs between the Pacific Ocean and the heavily wooded mountains. It was on this narrow strip that the Indians settled. Here the sea and rivers provided an abundance of food. The forest, especially the cedar tree, provided just about everything else. The Indians of the Northwest coast were fine woodworkers. They cut down trees with chisels of elkhorn and jade and split them into planks with stone mauls and yew wood wedges. They smoothed out the wood with a tool we now call an adze. It had a wooden handle and a blade made out of a sliver of animal bone. Some of the best woodworkers were the Haida. They built enormous plank houses with gabled or triangle-shaped roofs. People who belonged to the same clan lived together. A clan was a group of families believed to have the same ancestor. This ancestor may have been an animal, a bird, or a person, and was called the clan's totem. The people carved and painted images of their totems in wood, bone, and ivory. The Haida were the only ones to also carve in slate. Many homes had carved posts surrounding them. The front post rose high above the roof and had an opening which served as a door. We call these and the other carved and painted posts totem poles. A totem pole recorded the owner's claim to fame, his ancestry, his wealth, and his standing in the town. The right to carve totem poles was inherited. The designs themselves belonged to the family who owned the pole. If the artist made any mistakes, he would be disgraced. Figures on the totem poles and other works of art can be recognized by certain features. For example, the beaver was shown with two large front teeth and crossed lines on his tail. The wolf always had a long nose and large teeth. The Indians here also became highly skilled boat makers. They built dugout canoes in all sizes, the largest being over 60 feet long and 8 feet wide. To catch the salmon, herring, cod, and halibut, they used a variety of methods. hooks of bone and wood, wooden spears, nets, and several kinds of traps. Large fish and sea animals were sometimes clubbed before being boated. The fish was baked, steamed, broiled, and boiled. Much of it was dried and stored to last the winter. A few tribes supplemented their food supplies by hunting mountain goats, a difficult task indeed. Spoons and ladles were made from carved mountain goat horn. Once in a while, a village would be lucky and find a dead whale along the shore. It provided a great source of oil, meat, bone, and sinew. The only ones to actually go out to sea to hunt the whale were the Nootka. They went out in small fleets of about 4 or 5 canoes. It was extremely difficult and dangerous. The chief always had the first turn to thrust his harpoon into the whale. The crew members followed. Sealskin drags were attached to the line to tire the whale out. Sometimes the whale had to pull 40 or 50 drags before he was exhausted enough to finally be speared. Although the richness of the sea brought prosperity to the region, it also brought war. Every inch of ground and coastal waters were owned. Only those families with ownership rights could hunt, fish, or gather there. Since there was such a small amount of land and so many people who wanted it, fighting was common. They built huge warships from which bows and arrows and even paddles were used as weapons. In close battle, warriors fought with spears, knives, and daggers. The Tlingit even dressed in armor for battle. Grotesque carved wooden fighting helmets were worn with wide wooden collars and body and leg coverings of wooden slats. The Indians of the Northwest Coast had a definite class system: chiefs, nobles, commoners, and lowest of all, slaves. Unlike in the other parts of North America, here power was based upon wealth. Wealth included not only a person's possessions, but also his inherited rights. Inherited rights did not only include fishing, hunting, and other territorial rights. They also included such things as the right to practice carving and other crafts, and the right to say certain prayers. Sometimes rights were bought and sold. The most impressive displays of wealth were huge celebrations called potlatches. Potlatches were given to announce important events, such as the marriage of a high-ranking person, the completion of a new house, or the raising of a totem pole. The real purpose for giving a potlatch was for the chief to impress everyone with his wealth by showing that he could afford to give away many possessions. Neighboring villages were invited. The people spent a lot of time preparing food and gifts to be given away. The chief gathered all his possessions around him. Coppers, which were large flat sheets of copper in the shape of shields, were prized as symbols of wealth. Sometimes a chief would break a copper just to prove he could afford it. Huge amounts of food were served in carved feast dishes. Some of the bowls were as large as a canoe. Of course, to keep his honor, the invited chief would have to give an even bigger potlatch in return, so that he could give away more than he received. Although the Indians living in this mild climate didn't usually wear much clothing, during a potlatch, they dressed in their finest apparel. Beautiful fringed blankets woven by the Chilkat Indians were highly prized by high-ranking families as ceremonial robes. They were made of mountain goat wool and cedar bark fiber. Designs of bears, whales, and other figures were woven in. Dance skirts were woven in a similar way. Puffin beaks were often sewn on to make sounds as the dancers moved. The climate along the northwest coast was very rainy. Poncho-like capes of woven cedar bark were worn as protection against the rain. Basketry hats were also worn. Hats of chiefs and others of high rank usually had a tube or knob at the top. Nose decorations were popular in the region. Those who could afford it wore circles of rare shell. Others had to make do with polished wooden rods. Labrets were also worn by some women. They are plugs of shell, bone, or wood worn in a slit in the lower lip. Tattooing was also common among the women of the Northwest. Most had at least a few vertical chin stripes. Religion along the Northwest coast centered around the belief that every animal and person had a soul which became a ghost after death. It was the shaman's job to encourage the good spirits and control the evil ones. To do so, he often performed elaborate and frightening ceremonies. They wore skillfully carved masks to represent the spirits. Some masks used in the ceremonies were movable. By pulling the string on a double mask, the outer mask opened and an inner mask appeared. Performed in the dark, these ceremonies often gave the impression that the demons changed from one form to another. The shaman was thought to have the power to heal and to catch lost souls. To do so, he used a soul catcher, a tube of wood or bone open at both ends. Songs accompanied by drums and rattles were part of the ceremonies. Many rattles were carved in the form of a raven, which can be recognized by its long, straight beak. The raven was believed to be the creator of man. It was thought that it could appear in any form. The culture of the Northwest coast was a rich one, based upon easy access to the sea, rivers, and forests. The sea provided more than enough food. The forests provided materials for their homes and their transportation, their tools and weapons, their clothing, and a rich heritage of arts and crafts.